Teachers, what was your "this child is living through something horrible" moment? I taught 6th grade English, and there was this kid, I'll call him Mason, who had the kind of quiet that didn't feel shy, just rehearsed. Like every movement was calculated to not disturb invisible tripwires. When I called his name during attendance, he would jump. Literally jump. No matter how gently I said it, no matter how early in the year. He always sat with his shoulders rounded inward, like he was trying to fold himself into a smaller version of himself. I'd put assignments on his desk and he'd flinch like I'd thrown it. I'd ask him a question, and he'd immediately apologize before answering, as if the act of speaking was something he might be punished for. One day, I watched another teacher drop a stack of books in the hallway, and the sound wasn't especially loud, but Mason went full fight or flight, hands over ears, ducked under the desk. Shaking, kids laughed. He didn't even seem to notice them. I walked him into the hall and sat with him on the floor. And he whispered, without me asking, I'm sorry, please don't tell him I messed up." I had never said a word about messing up. I hadn't even asked anything yet. That was the day I called the counselor. I learned more than I can ethically repeat. But I will say this, sometimes the smallest, quietest kids are surviving the loudest homes. This girl, Elena, was in my 4th grade class. Beautiful, bright, always smiling too widely, like she needed people to feel comfortable around her. She'd linger during snack time, staring at what other kids brought. I started noticing food going missing: granola bars, juice boxes, crackers. One day, I gently asked her if she was hungry. She burst into tears immediately. Not normal kid crying, silent panicked crying like she'd been caught committing a crime. She begged me not to call her mom. That was suspicious enough, but then I saw her backpack. She had stuffed it with unopened food from other kids' lunchboxes, but none of it was eaten. Turns out she wasn't stealing to eat. She was stealing because her little siblings cried at home when they were hungry and she didn't know how else to help them. She was 8 and already parenting 2 toddlers. I drove home that day feeling like the smallest person alive, thinking of how proud she looked handing her siblings stale crackers like she'd hunted for them. I taught high school special ed. There was this boy, Jacob, who fell asleep constantly. Not the normal teenage nodding off, deep, out-cold, twitching sleep. I pulled him aside one day and asked how many hours he got a night. He shrugged and said, "Depends when the couch is free." I asked if he had a bed. He said sort of, which is kid speak for no. Eventually, he admitted he slept on a wooden floor behind a recliner because his stepdad didn't like feet walking around at night. So he needed to be somewhere he wouldn't be seen. We arranged for him to get a bed through a local nonprofit. When it was delivered, he came to school the next day with this stunned, shaky smile and told me, "I didn't know it was supposed to feel like floating." That haunted me for years. There's a guy I used to see almost every morning at the Greyhound station when I worked the ticket counter. Not a passenger, not an employee, just a man who existed in the space between. He always carried the same small black suitcase, never rolling it, always gripping the handle so tight it looked like part of his hand. He'd sit on the molded plastic chairs near Gate 4, every day, every morning. Weekends, holidays, snowstorms, didn't matter. He'd show up, he'd sit. He'd watch the arrivals board like something sacred was written on it. And then, after staring for an hour or two, he'd leave again, still gripping that little black suitcase like it contained the oxygen he breathed. I only learned his story because one day the station was empty and I brought him a free coffee. He flinched like I'd thrown something at him. Then he apologized about 8 times in a row, which told me plenty already. We talked. Well, I talked. He mostly scraped out a few words here and there like they cost him something. His name was Kyle, and he told me in bits and broken pieces that he used to be married, used to have a house, used to have a life where you put things in drawers and didn't constantly think about whether that meant you'd be too slow to run. He'd been with this woman Mara for almost 10 years. At first, she was charming, wild, impulsive. The kind of person who made you want to stand closer because her energy was better than sunlight. Then slowly, painfully slowly, she turned into something else. She'd track his location every minute, claiming it was because she cared. She'd show up at his workplace unannounced and accuse random customers of flirting with him. She'd drag him out of bed at 3 a.m., demanding he recite where he'd been that day, in order with timestamps. If he hesitated even to think, she'd scream that hesitation was guilt. He lived walking on glass dust. He learned to pack and repack his things so quietly, the zippers barely whispered. He learned that the wrong tone could trigger a 6-hour argument that ended with him apologizing for crimes he'd never committed. But the suitcase, that's the part that chilled me the most. He told me she once confiscated all of his clothes and belongings, literally locked them in storage, because she said he couldn't be trusted with freedom. He had nothing left except the small black suitcase he'd stashed at a friend's house for emergencies. She didn't know about that one. It became a symbol, the only physical proof he still had choices. And one night after she slapped him for breathing too loud, he took the suitcase and ran. He didn't go back, not even once. But here's where it gets haunting. He said every time he tried to unpack, every time he tried to buy a dresser, every time he tried to put down roots, something in him screamed, "Don't do it." Not like anxiety, like a survival alarm, like danger lived in folded shirts and organized closets, like permanence was a trap door with her standing on the other side. So he moved into a small weekly rental, never unpacked, slept with the suitcase beside the bed, and every morning he came to the Greyhound station, watched the destinations scroll, and asked himself if today was the day he needed to disappear again. Not because she was following him anymore. She wasn't. He admitted she probably forgot he existed by now, but because the part of him she rewired never shut off. That part still expected the knock on the door, still expected the accusations, still expected the punishment for imagined sins. A soul can heal, sure, but sometimes the body keeps the escape plan loaded ready, trembling. One day I didn't see him, or the next week. His absence felt loud, like a missing painting, leaving a perfect rectangle on a wall. A month later, he walked in, smiling. Actually smiling, no suitcase. He looked 10 years lighter. I asked him what happened, and he said, "I finally opened it." Just that, no details, no explanation. But there was something in his eyes, not relief exactly, but something gentler, less hunted, that told me enough. Some people unpack clothes. Some people unpack trauma. Some people unpack the version of themselves they were forced to bury. Whatever he unpacked, it finally made the world big enough for him to stay in one place. I'll always remember him not because he was broken, but because he wanted so desperately to stop running even if he had no idea how, and eventually he did. I used to work at this late-night diner off the interstate. The kind of place where truckers drift in half asleep and teenagers sneak in after curfew, and old men nurse black coffee like it's the only warmth left in their lives. We were open 24/7, and the graveyard shift was mine, mostly because I needed the money, but also because the quiet suited me. And that's when I met him, a man who always took the same booth, always at the same time, 2:15 a.m. tall, wiry, with the haunted look of someone who hadn't slept through a whole night in years. He kept his hood up even indoors. He always sat with his back to the wall like he needed to see every exit at once. We called him the Shadow, not to his face obviously, but the nickname fit. He moved like he expected to disappear at any second. At first, I thought he was just another drifter, but then I noticed a pattern anytime the lights flickered. Even for half a second, and they flickered a lot because the wiring in that place was older than half the customers. He'd freeze, eyes wide breath, held hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. I'd joke, "Relax the lights, do that every night." But he never laughed, he never even smiled. He'd just watch the ceiling like he was waiting for something to descend. One night, after a particularly bad flicker that made the neon open sign outside sputter like it was dying, he whispered, "She found me again. I should have let it go." People mutter weird things at 2 a.m., but something about the terror in his voice made my chest tighten. So I asked, "Who's she?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at his untouched plate of eggs. Then he said, barely audible, "My mother." Okay, that wasn't the answer I expected. He wasn't a kid, he had to be in his mid-30s. And the way he said it wasn't like, my mother's worried about me, it was like, my mother hunts me. He told me bits and pieces, never all at once. Honestly, it felt like he was pushing the memories out, only when they got too loud inside his head. But here's what I eventually pieced together. He grew up in a house where silence wasn't peaceful, it was strategic. Where you learned to tiptoe not because you were sneaking out, but because you didn't want to wake whatever version of her was sleeping, where love was a weapon and fear was a leash. His mother had episodes. That's the best way I can describe it. Delusion so strong she believed the lights flickering meant spirits were communicating with her, that shadows stretching along the floor were warnings that the house whispered to her, telling her what her children were doing when they weren't in sight. She'd storm into his room in the middle of the night screaming that the lights told her. He'd disobeyed her. Sometimes she'd drag him out of bed, shaking him, demanding he confess to things he didn't even understand. The flicker was the trigger, her switch flipping. Every time the lights blinked, his heart learned to sprint. Eventually, as he got older, he tried to run away. First when he was 13, she found him, brought him back by the arm nails, digging into his skin. Second time at 16, she found him again. That time she cut the power to the whole house for 3 days. As punishment, walking around with candles, whispering to the walls like they were allies. He didn't escape her until he was 18 and legally able to vanish across state lines. And yet decades later, in a diner where he was just another anonymous night drifter, a flickering light would still turn him into a trembling kid, waiting for footsteps in the hallway. I started seating him in the booth under the bulb that flickered. The least I told the manager the wiring needed fixing. I even tried tightening a few screws myself. None of it helped much. The diner was old. It flickered because that's what it did. One night, his last night, the flicker wasn't a flicker. The power actually went out. Full blackout. I heard him inhale sharply, like someone had just stabbed him in the ribs. And then he whispered into the darkness, "No, please, I left. I found him crouched under the table, hands over his ears, rocking like he was shrinking back into the version of himself that survived her. I slid under the table with him, screw professionalism, and I just said, 'She's not here, you're here, and you're safe.' He didn't respond, but he didn't bolt either. When the lights finally came back, he looked at me with this exhausted, broken gratitude like someone seeing daylight after being trapped underground. After that night, he never came back. No one knew his name. No one asked. He just disappeared. Maybe he moved on. Maybe he found a place with lights that never flickered. But sometimes when I'm lying awake and the bulb in my bedroom lamp buzzes for a second, I think about him. About how some people grow up afraid of monsters in the dark, while others grow up afraid that the dark is the only time the monsters feel comfortable enough to come out again. And I hope truly that wherever he is, the lights finally stay steady for him. There was this new student who joined our class in 7th grade, Adrian Skinny Pale, the kind of kid who tried so hard to blend into the background that it almost made him more noticeable. He always wore long sleeves even when it was hot. He always sat in corners like he wanted walls behind him, and he avoided mirrors, like legitimately avoided them. We had this long row of reflective trophy cases in the hallway, and he'd walk the long way around the building just so he didn't have to pass them. Most kids whispered that he was weird. I don't think they meant it in a cruel way. Kids just repeat whatever labels are easiest. But I watched him because something felt off in a way I couldn't explain. He wasn't shy. He wasn't anxious. He was vigilant, like someone who had learned to anticipate danger from angles no one else could see. The moment, the one that stuck in my head forever, happened during a stupid group project in science class. The teacher made us pair up randomly, and I got assigned to Adrian. He visibly tensed like a threatened animal, not because he disliked me, but because partnering up with anyone meant losing control of variables he desperately needed to monitor. Still, he nodded and followed me to the lab table. Everything went fine until we had to use those small metal mirrors to reflect light through a prism. I didn't even think about it, I just grabbed a mirror and angled it. The second the reflection passed across his face, he gasped, like I'd splashed boiling water on him. He shoved the chair back so violently it screeched, pressed himself against the wall, and covered his mouth with both hands. His whole body was shaking. Everyone stared. The teacher rushed over. I was frozen because I had no idea what I'd done. But the way he whispered, "No, no, please not again," made my stomach twist. He wouldn't look at the mirror, wouldn't look at anything reflective. The teacher escorted him out, and we all sat there pretending the room didn't feel heavier. Later during lunch, I found him sitting alone outside by the dumpsters of all places. I asked if he wanted company. He said no one wants to sit by garbage. I said, "I do." That got the smallest exhale of a laugh, and for whatever reason, he started talking. He told me something I've never forgotten. He said he didn't avoid mirrors because he was superstitious or scared of ghosts or anything like that. He avoided them because his mother used them as a weapon, not physically, psychologically. When he was little, around 5 or 6, she'd drag him to the bathroom mirror whenever she was angry. She'd grab him by the shoulders, force him to look at his own reflection, and say things like, "See that? That's the face of a burden. That's why your father left. That's the reason I'm miserable. Look at yourself. Do you see how unlovable you are?" And then this is what broke me. She'd smile at him in the mirror, but not kindly. A cold, twisted smile. A smile that wasn't meant for him, but for the version of him trapped in the reflection. He said the worst part wasn't what she said. It was that sometimes when he was crying, he thought he saw the reflection smile on its own. That's how deep the trauma had embedded itself. His brain had started filling in cruelty even where none existed. So when he saw himself in the metal lab mirror, just for a split second, he thought the reflection was going to smile again. I remember sitting there with him, the cold metal door behind us, the distant shouts of kids playing on the field, and thinking some kids don't grow up with monsters under their beds. Their monsters tuck them in, kiss them goodnight, and teach them how to hate themselves. I didn't tell a teacher, I didn't tell a counselor I was 12 and didn't know how to hold something that big. I just became his friend. Not in a savior way, just someone he could exist around without feeling watched. Over the next few months, he slowly started testing reflections again. First, the spoon in the cafeteria. Then the chrome handrail on the stairs. Then the window of the bus. Each time he'd glance quickly, look away, breathe through the panic. And I'll never forget the day he looked in the trophy case on purpose. He didn't stare long a second. Maybe 2, but he didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't see a monster. He just saw himself. And for once, he didn't look afraid. When he turned to me, he said softly, "It's weird. He's starting to look like me again." He moved schools the next year. I never saw him again. But sometimes, when I pass a store window and catch my reflection unexpectedly, I think about him, and I hope wherever he is, he's finally able to look in the mirror without seeing her cruelty staring back through him. There was this boy in my 3rd grade class named Nolan, and he was twitchy. I don't mean hyper or excitable. He was quiet, almost too quiet, but his eyes darted around the room like he was tracking invisible objects. He startled at the sound of chairs scraping pencils tapping even when someone cleared their throat too loudly. He was polite painfully, so the kind of kid who apologized for things before they even happened. But the moment that stays with me forever happened on a rainy Tuesday. We had indoor recess, and for once the room felt calm. No shouting, no chaos, just soft chatter and the sound of rain hitting the windows. Most kids don't notice silence, they fill it. But Nolan stopped moving altogether. He just froze, staring straight ahead like he was listening to something nobody else could hear. I walked over and asked if he was okay. He blinked a few times and said, "It's weird." I asked him what was weird. He said, "It's too quiet. Something bad always happens when it gets quiet." A chill went down my spine. Kids don't say things like that unless they've learned it the hard way. I sat down next to him and asked what he meant. He hesitated, not like he was hiding a secret, but like he physically didn't know if he was allowed to tell one. Finally, he whispered, "When the house is loud, they're yelling at each other. When it gets quiet, that's when they look at me." I swear, I felt my heart drop into my stomach. He explained in this detached, matter-of-fact tone. The tone kids use when they've normalized horror that his parents didn't fight with each other. They fought around him, they'd scream and throw things and slam doors, but once they exhausted themselves, the silence settled. That's when they would turn to him as if he were the cause of everything. "You're why we're stressed. You're why we're stuck together. You're why we can't have nice things." He told me this like he was talking about the weather. No tremble, no emotion, just resignation. That was the day I noticed his reflexes. If another child laughed too loud, he'd flinch. If a book dropped, he'd duck like something was coming at him. When I asked if noise bothered him, he said, "No, noise means I'm safe. It means they're too busy with each other to come for me." That sentence hit me harder than any scream could have. I called the counselor immediately. She spent an hour with him, came out looking pale and furious. She made the call to CPS herself. What they found was what we suspected. A household built on emotional shrapnel. No one hitting him, no bruises, no broken bones, just daily psychological landmines, emotional neglect, verbal degradation, blaming him for the failures of two adults who should have protected him. The system moved slowly, but it moved. He was placed temporarily with relatives. When he came back to school a few weeks later, he looked different, lighter, like someone had wiped a bit of the tension from behind his eyes. The moment I realized he was healing was during an art activity. A kid dropped a box of crayons, loud crash, big noise, and Nolan didn't flinch. He just turned, looked at the mess, and laughed. And it wasn't forced. It wasn't nervous. It was the laugh of a kid who finally understood a loud noise didn't mean danger. Later that day during dismissal, it started raining again. Same soft drumming on the windows. Nolan sat at his desk listening. I asked what he was thinking. He said, "It's quiet. But it's okay. Quiet now." I went home and cried like I hadn't in years. Because children should never have to learn the difference between safe quiet and danger quiet. They should just feel safe. And I'm grateful he finally did. This one still makes me physically sick. The kid's name was Marcus, 4th grader, small for his age but sharp as a tack. He carried his backpack everywhere. He wouldn't put it in the cubbies, wouldn't leave it during recess, wouldn't even set it down during lunch. I thought at first maybe he had separation anxiety about something inside, a toy, a notebook, whatever. But one day I noticed the backpack was basically empty. Maybe 2 pencils and an apple. Nothing worth guarding. When I asked him gently why he needed to keep it with him, he said, "Because if they start fighting, I need to be ready." My heart dropped. He went on to explain in the most matter-of-fact tone that sometimes his parents would get into screaming matches in the middle of the night and things would get thrown and he'd have to run. Sometimes to the neighbor's yard, sometimes behind the dumpster of a nearby gas station. He kept the backpack with him everywhere because you never know when it'll happen again. We called CPS. The situation was worse than we thought. Violent domestic episodes. Marcus often escaping through a window. He had trained himself to sleep lightly, listening for certain tones in their voices. He was 9 years old and living like a soldier. Months later, after being placed with a foster family, he finally left his backpack in the cubby one day. The whole class noticed I asked him, "Forgetting something?" He looked at the cubby, then said softly, "No, I don't need it now." I excused myself and cried in the hallway. Her name was Tessa. Soft-spoken, artsy, always doodling little birds in the margins of her worksheets. She was polite to the point of unnatural. I never heard her raise her voice, even when other kids teased her. One day, she accidentally spilled her water bottle on her notebook and started crying quietly, instantly, like someone flipped a switch. I went to help her, telling her it wasn't a big deal, but she kept saying, I'm sorry, I'll clean it, I'll buy a new one, please don't tell her." "Tell who?" I asked. "My mom," she whispered. Then she added, "She says crying is manipulative." That sentence hit me like a truck. Crying manipulative. For a kid, we sent her to the counselor. What came out was heartbreaking. Her mother punished emotional displays. If Tessa cried, she'd get lectured about being weak. If she didn't cry during pain, her mother accused her of being cold. Basically, the girl couldn't win months after intervention and therapy. Tessa had a moment during art class where she messed up her painting. She frowned, looked frustrated, and then just exhaled. No panic, no apologies, no bracing. She whispered to me, "It's okay to mess up sometimes, right?" I said, "Absolutely. That's how people learn." She smiled, and I swear it was the first real smile I ever saw from her. This one sticks with me more than any other. It was a quiet boy named Ezra. Smart, polite, always early. Too early. He'd be waiting outside the building 45 minutes before anyone else. When I asked why, he said, "Because it's safer here in the morning." That alone set off alarms. But the moment I truly understood happened during a science activity. We were testing circuits, and someone accidentally left a lamp plugged in after we were done. The light glowed softly on the table. Ezra froze. Then he sprinted across the room, unplugged it with shaking hands, and started apologizing over and over. It was on, I didn't mean to, I'll fix it, I'll fix it, I'll fix it." He wasn't even the one who left it on. I had to take him outside to breathe. Eventually he whispered, "I can't leave lights on. He says it's wasting money. He says people who waste money don't deserve to eat." Turns out his father would check the meter and punish him for costing the house too much. The kid had been skipping dinners for things like forgetting to turn off the hallway light. We got social services involved. He ended up living with an aunt months later after school. I noticed he intentionally left the lamp on in the science room. A tiny rebellious grin on his face. He said, "Look, nothing happens." It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. There was a girl named Raina who transferred into my kindergarten class mid-year. The first thing you noticed about her was how stiff she was. Kids that age are basically jelly with legs, but Raina moved like someone was always bracing for impact. The second thing you noticed was that she hugged everyone. Constantly. Too tightly. Almost desperately. At first, I thought she was just affectionate, until the day we had a fire drill. The alarm went off and the entire class jumped, but Raina grabbed the nearest kid so hard he screamed. I had to pry her off. When I got her calm enough to talk, she kept saying, sorry. I thought something bad was happening." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "I hug my mom so she doesn't hit me as hard. It works sometimes." I swear the world just stopped. We brought in the counselor immediately. As they talked, we learned her mother's version of affection was twisted and violent. When the mom got angry, Raina would try to stop the blows by grabbing onto her. The mother interpreted it as clinginess and punished her for that too. This tiny girl thought hugs were a shield. After she was placed in foster care, she came back to school months later with a completely different energy. She hugged, still but softly, gently, and she always asked first. One time she hugged me around the waist and said, "This is how it's supposed to be, right?" I had to bite my tongue not to cry right in front of her. I said, "Yeah, sweetheart, that's exactly how it's supposed to be." There was this boy in my 5th grade class, Jason, who always acted like he took up too much space. He walked like he was trying to fold into himself, like he was apologizing for existing. One day, he tripped during recess and hit his chin on the edge of a metal slide, split it open, blood everywhere. The other kids screamed, but Jason's reaction haunted me far more than the wound. He clapped his hand over his mouth and kept saying, I'm sorry, I'll clean it, I didn't mean." Like he was terrified the injury itself was a misbehavior. I told him it wasn't his fault and that he was hurt, but he just shook his head frantically. In the nurse's office, when she dabbed his chin, he flinched violently. The nurse asked if it hurt, and he whispered, "No, I'll be good, please don't call him." Her eyes snapped to mine the way professionals do when they hear something coded. She asked gently, "Call who?" And Jason went dead silent, like he'd swallowed the words by force. When we called his mom instead, she didn't answer. The emergency number was a man. That man did answer. Coldest voice I've ever heard. He didn't ask how Jason was. He didn't ask what happened. He just said, "Put him on." When the nurse explained Jason was with us, the guy said, "Then tell him I'll deal with him later." I will never forget the way Jason's face drained of color when he overheard that. You could see the life leave his eyes like someone turned off a switch. A mandatory reporter was contacted immediately. The investigation later revealed more than I ever wanted to know. Physical intimidation, fear-based obedience drills, and punishments designed around humiliation. After he was removed from that home, Jason came to school. Different. Still quiet. Still shy, but less like a ghost. One day out of nowhere, he said, "I tripped today, and it was kind of funny." It was the first time he'd ever treated a mistake like something human instead of something punishable. I cried in my car before driving home. Last one is the hardest for me. There was a girl who would always fill silence with humming. Not quiet, humming loud, desperate humming. I thought it was an attention thing. At first, I asked her several times to save the humming for free time. Then one day, I stepped out of the room for a few minutes. When I came back, the class was silent, and she was under her desk shaking violently, hands over ears, humming so hard her voice cracked. Later, she admitted that silence at home meant her parents were about to fight great explosive fights. So silence wasn't peaceful to her, it was the sound of a storm coming. She needed noise to feel safe. I've never thought about silence the same way since.